Geneva International Airport exists in a strange dimension where time moves differently for different people. For some, it's a blur of efficiency, private lounges, expedited security, and silent escorts whisking them from limousine to aircraft. For others, it's an exhausting maze of lines, delays, and the constant anxiety of missed connections. On this particular winter afternoon, the temperature outside hovered just below freezing. Inside Terminal 1, however, a different kind of coldness permeated the air, the invisible barrier between the privileged and everyone else. The departure hall hummed with the familiar symphony of international travel, rolling luggage wheels clicking rhythmically against polished floors, the multilingual announcements echoing through unseen speakers, the hiss of espresso machines in overpriced cafes, and the constant electronic chirping of boarding notifications. But in the exclusive priority boarding lounge, accessible only to those with the right credit cards, the right tickets, or the right connections, the atmosphere was markedly different. Here, the lighting was softer, the chairs were leather, and the people moved with the unhurried confidence of those who never worry about overhead bin space. Among the designer luggage and tailored overcoats, one figure stood in sharp contrast. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, waited near gate B12 with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that dignity doesn't require decoration. He wore his standard military fatigues, not pressed and ceremonial, but practical and lived in. His beret sat comfortably on his head, and his boots showed the honest wear of someone who actually walked in them, not someone who wore them for photo opportunities. At 43 years old, Ibrahim carried himself with a quiet intensity that came from years of military service before his unexpected rise to leadership. His eyes, deep and observant, constantly scanned his surroundings, not with paranoia, but with the trained awareness of someone who had survived multiple attempts on his life. He traveled with minimal security today. Just 2 aides stood at a respectful distance, understanding their president's preference for handling his own affairs when possible. Ibrahim despised the theatrical pageantry that often surrounded heads of state. He wasn't returning from a diplomatic summit or a luxury vacation. He had spent 3 days in Geneva meeting with humanitarian organizations, negotiating for medical supplies and educational resources for his nation. The meetings had been exhausting. Behind closed doors, wealthy bureaucrats had lectured him about governance standards and transparency metrics, while their own countries sold weapons to dictatorships and sheltered blood money in numbered accounts. But Ibrahim had smiled, nodded, and secured what his people needed. That was the game. That was leadership. Now he just wanted to go home. The boarding announcement crackled through the lounge speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning priority boarding for Flight LX843 to Ouagadougou with connections to West African destinations. We invite our first-class passengers and elite status members to board at this time. Ibrahim picked up his single duffel bag, the same bag he had carried as a captain in the army, now patched and faded but still functional. He slung it over his shoulder and moved toward the boarding lane with purposeful strides. That's when the collision course began. Richard Sterling III didn't walk through airports. He conquered them. At 6 feet 2 inches and 230 pounds, most of it concentrated around his midsection from years of expense account dinners, Richard moved through public spaces like a man who had never been told no and didn't plan to start hearing it now. He was 57 years old, third-generation wealth, and executive vice president of Sterling Axum Mining Corporation, a multinational company that extracted precious metals from African soil with the efficiency of a vacuum cleaner and approximately the same level of concern for what it left behind. Richard's suit was Italian, custom-tailored, and cost more than most people earned in 3 months. His watch was Swiss, his shoes were English, and his attitude was distinctly American, the particular flavor of American exceptionalism that mistakes wealth for wisdom and volume for validity. He had spent the morning in Zurich closing a deal that would give his company mineral rights in 3 West African nations. The contracts were favorable, extremely favorable to Sterling Axum. The regional officials who signed them would retire wealthy men. What happened to the local communities whose land would be stripped, whose water would be poisoned, whose children would work in dangerous conditions? Well, that wasn't Richard's problem. He told himself he was bringing economic development. He believed it the way people believe convenient lies. Now Richard was late for a connecting flight to Abidjan, where he would finalize another deal. He was stressed, jet-lagged, and in no mood for obstacles. His phone rang for the 17th time that hour. He answered without breaking stride, his voice booming across the quiet lounge. "No, Marcus, I don't care what the environmental report says. We bury it. We commission another study from a firm that will give us the numbers we need. That's what we pay consultants for, to tell us we're right. Yes, I'm serious. Do I sound like I'm joking?" He paused at a mirror near the gate, adjusting his tie and checking his teeth for remnants of his lunch. Satisfied with his reflection, he continued his call. "These local activists don't understand economics. They want their villages to stay poor and pure. We're offering jobs, real jobs. If some of them happen to be 12 years old, well, that's cultural context, not child labor. Different standards for different markets, Marcus. That's Business 101. As he approached the boarding counter, Richard finally noticed the man in military fatigues standing in front of him. Without a second thought, without even ending his phone call, Richard simply stepped around Ibrahim and placed himself directly at the counter, cutting the line as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The young woman behind the counter, Elena Kowalski, had worked for the airline for 3 years. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, angry passengers, drunk passengers, entitled passengers. But something about this moment made her stomach tighten with anxiety. She glanced at Ibrahim, then at Richard, then back at Ibrahim. The president gave her a small nod, as if to say, "Handle this however you need to." Elena cleared her throat nervously. "Excuse me, sir," she said to Richard, her Swiss-German accent making her words precise but tentative. "This gentleman was next in line." Richard didn't turn around. He simply waved his hand dismissively over his shoulder while continuing his phone conversation. "Hold on, Marcus." He put the phone against his chest and addressed Elena without looking at her. "Sweetheart, the help can wait. I have a meeting in 4 hours and I need to be seated immediately. First-class ticket, platinum status. Process it." He slapped his ticket and passport on the counter with the casual arrogance of someone who had been obeyed their entire life. Ibrahim stood perfectly still. His face remained neutral, but anyone who knew him well, his aides certainly did, would recognize the subtle shift in his posture. His weight balanced slightly forward. His hands, which had been relaxed, now rested with deliberate placement. He was a soldier reading the battlefield, deciding whether this situation required engagement or could be diffused with silence. He chose engagement. "Excuse me," Ibrahim said, his voice deep and even, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need to shout. "I believe the lady is speaking to you." The lounge went quieter. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Passengers looked up from their phones and newspapers. Richard turned around slowly, his face registering first confusion, then annoyance, and finally contempt. His eyes scanned Ibrahim from head to toe. The military fatigues, the worn boots, the simple beret, the weathered face of a man who had spent time in the sun and dust, not in air-conditioned offices. A nasty smile spread across Richard's face like oil on water. "Oh, I heard her," Richard said, deliberately hanging up his phone with theatrical slowness. "I just chose to ignore it. Listen, buddy, the military transport is probably out on the tarmac somewhere with the cargo. This is the first-class lane for commercial passengers. You and your little costume party are blocking paying customers." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Several passengers gasped audibly. Elena's hand went to her mouth. Ibrahim's aides tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward their belts before remembering they weren't armed. This was Switzerland, not a conflict zone. But Ibrahim didn't react with anger. Instead, something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "I have a ticket," Ibrahim said simply, reaching toward his jacket pocket. "A ticket?" Richard laughed, looking around for an audience. A few other passengers had gathered, drawn by the commotion. "Let me guess, economy class. Maybe you got upgraded as some kind of diversity initiative, or are you security for someone important?" He leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dripping with false concern. "Be honest with me, are you lost? Do you need directions?" Ibrahim let his hand drop from his pocket. He studied Richard with the clinical interest of someone observing an interesting specimen of something unfortunate. "I am not lost," Ibrahim said quietly. "Well, you're certainly in the wrong place," Richard continued, emboldened by what he perceived as passivity. He stepped closer, invading Ibrahim's personal space using his height and bulk to intimidate. Let me explain something to you about how the real world works, soldier boy. People like me, we build things. We create jobs. We move economies. We keep the world turning. People like you? You follow orders and salute flags. There's a hierarchy here, and you need to learn your place in it. He reached out his hand, intending to physically push Ibrahim aside. What happened next occurred in less than 2 seconds, but would be replayed on social media thousands of times, analyzed frame by frame, discussed by everyone from political commentators to martial arts experts. Richard's hand moved toward Ibrahim's shoulder, fingers spread to shove him aside. But before contact was made, Ibrahim's arm rose in a smooth, economical motion. No wasted energy, no excessive force, and intercepted Richard's wrist in midair. It wasn't a grab, it wasn't aggressive. It was simply there, solid as stone, stopping Richard's momentum completely. Richard's hand bounced back as if he had struck a wall. He stumbled backward, more from surprise than from any force Ibrahim had applied. "I suggest," Ibrahim said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow cutting through every other sound in the terminal, "that you keep your hands to yourself." For a split second, just one heartbeat, raw fear flashed across Richard's face. Some primal part of his brain recognized that he had just attempted to physically confront someone far more dangerous than himself. Someone who had seen actual combat, who had fought in actual battles, who knew exactly how to handle threats. But Richard's ego, like water behind a dam, rushed back to fill the void left by fear. His face flushed deep crimson, his hands balled into fists, and he made the decision that would transform this from an embarrassing encounter into an international incident. "He attacked me," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with manufactured outrage. He looked around at the crowd that had gathered, making sure the smartphones he spotted were recording. "Did you see that? This lunatic just assaulted me. I want security. I want the police. Get this dangerous person away from me." Elena grabbed her phone with shaking hands, but she didn't need to call. 2 airport security officers were already jogging toward the commotion, their boots squeaking on the polished floor. These were contract security associates, not Swiss police, private security hired by the airport to handle disturbances. Jakob and Martin, both former military themselves, had responded to hundreds of these situations. And like many people in positions of minor authority, they had unconscious biases that shaped their perception of threat. They saw a wealthy white man in an expensive suit, clearly upset. They saw a black man in military clothing, standing his ground. In their minds, influenced by countless media portrayals and cultural stereotypes, the narrative wrote itself before they even asked a question. "What's the problem here?" Jakob asked, his hand resting on his hip near his radio and taser. He directed the question to the room generally, but kept his eyes locked on Ibrahim. "Thank God you're here," Richard said, his voice shaking with practiced indignation. "I was simply trying to board my flight when this man blocked my path and physically assaulted me. He grabbed my arm and pushed me. I think he might be mentally unstable or possibly intoxicated. He's clearly carrying some kind of weapon." He gestured vaguely at Ibrahim's jacket. "He needs to be removed immediately before someone gets hurt." Martin, the second officer, moved to flank Ibrahim, boxing him in. "Sir," he said sharply, all pretense of politeness gone, "step back from the counter. Hands where I can see them. Now." Ibrahim didn't move. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands visible at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. He had been in far more dangerous situations than this: coup attempts, ambushes, political assassinations. This was theater, not threat. "I have done nothing wrong," Ibrahim said calmly. "I am simply waiting to board my flight." "I said step back," Jakob barked, moving into Ibrahim's personal space, his chest puffed out in the universal display of authoritarian dominance. "You are causing a disturbance. You need to show me your identification immediately and explain why you're harassing VIP passengers or you're coming with us, in handcuffs if necessary." "Harassing?" Ibrahim repeated, and a dry chuckle escaped his lips, not mocking but genuinely bemused at the absurdity of the accusation. "I think if you review your security cameras, you will see a different story than the one being told." "I don't need to check cameras," Jakob sneered, his authority complex fully activated now. "I have a complaint from a priority passenger. That's all I need. Now give me your passport if you even have one, or we're going to have a serious problem." Richard crossed his arms, a triumphant grin plastered. Across his face, he was enjoying this. Go ahead, he goaded. Show them your papers if they're not fake. The crowd had swollen to nearly 40 people now, all recording on their phones. Elena looked like she might cry. Ibrahim's aides looked ready to intervene despite knowing it would make things worse. The tension was a living thing, coiled and ready to strike. Ibrahim slowly moved his hand toward the inside pocket of his military jacket. Both security officers flinched, their hands going to their tasers. Slowly, Jacob yelled, his voice cracking with adrenaline, do not make any sudden moves. Ibrahim kept his eyes on Jacob, his expression unreadable. His fingers brushed against the leather cover of his diplomatic passport, a document that would change everything in this terminal. But before he could pull it out, a new voice cut through the chaos like a knife through fog. Put those weapons away before you make the biggest mistake of your careers. The voice came from the crew access corridor, a path most passengers never notice. Captain Andrew Miller emerged through the security door, and everyone in the terminal recognized authority when they saw it. Captain Miller was 62 years old, with silver-gray hair, piercing blue eyes, and 4 gold stripes on the shoulder of his crisp white uniform shirt. He had been flying commercial aircraft for 33 years, accumulating over 20,000 flight hours, and he had exactly 0 patience for bullies and bigots. He had been standing at the coffee stand, sipping an espresso before his pre-flight briefing, when he witnessed the entire confrontation unfold, and what he saw disgusted him. The security officers hesitated, confused by this new authority figure. Their tasers lowered slightly. Captain Miller, Jacob stammered, we have a situation here, this passenger. This passenger, Captain Miller interrupted, pointing a stern finger at Richard, has been acting like an entitled child since he walked into this terminal. I was standing right there. He pointed to the coffee stand 20 meters away. I saw everything. He cut in line, he insulted this gentleman, and when he was called out for his behavior, he invented an assault allegation and wasted everyone's time. Richard's face turned an alarming shade of purple. Excuse me, do you know who I am? I am a platinum-level frequent flyer. I personally know the CEO of this airline. You're just a glorified bus driver in a costume. Why don't you stick to flying the plane and let the adults handle security? The crowd gasped collectively. Insulting a captain in his own terminal was like insulting a ship's captain on his bridge, a breach of protocol so severe it was almost funny. Captain Miller took 3 deliberate steps toward Richard, closing the distance until they were face to face. When he spoke, his voice was ice cold and harder than granite. I'm the commander of the aircraft you intend to board, he said slowly, emphasizing each word. Which means I have the ultimate authority over who boards and who doesn't. Under international aviation law and company policy, I can deny boarding to any passenger who poses a threat to safety, security, or the comfort of other passengers. He paused, letting that sink in. Right now, the only threat I see in this terminal is your ego and your mouth. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He looked around frantically for support, but the crowd's mood had shifted completely. People were murmuring against him now. The smartphones were still recording, but the narrative had flipped. Ibrahim watched this exchange with quiet appreciation. He gave Captain Miller a respectful nod. Thank you, Captain. Your intervention is appreciated, but let us not delay your flight any longer. I believe these officers need to see my identification so we can resolve this situation and everyone can proceed. Captain Miller stepped back slightly, giving Ibrahim space but remaining present. By all means, he said. With slow, deliberate movements, making sure both security officers could see exactly what he was doing, Ibrahim reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a document. It wasn't a standard passport. The leather was a deep burgundy red, almost black in certain lights. The cover bore gold embossed lettering and the national seal of Burkina Faso. It was the unmistakable format of a diplomatic passport. Richard snorted. Finally, let's see this fake ID. What is it? A library card? A gym membership? Jacob took the passport with skeptical hands, clearly expecting to find something wrong with it. He flipped it open to the photo identification page. He looked at the photo, he looked at Ibrahim, he looked back at the photo. The blood drained from Jacob's face so fast that Martin thought his partner might faint. Is this real? Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. Richard, unaware of what was happening, laughed loudly. Of course it's not real, Lou. "K at him, just arrest him already and let's move on." But Jakob didn't arrest anyone. Instead, his hands began to shake. He closed the passport with reverence, holding it with both hands as if it were a sacred relic. He looked at Martin, his eyes wide with horrified realization. "Put the taser away," Jakob whispered urgently. "Put it away now." "What, why?" "Because we just threatened a head of state." But Richard Sterling, drunk on his own indignation, didn't hear that whisper. He was too busy loving the sound of his own voice. He stepped forward and grabbed the passport from Jakob's trembling hands. "Let me see that. I bet it's printed on someone's inkjet printer, probably from one of those fake ID websites." He flipped it open, ready to mock Ibrahim one final time. His eyes focused on the text. Republic of Burkina Faso diplomatic passport name. Traoré Ibrahim title, President of the Republic. Richard's face went through several rapid transformations. Confusion, realization, horror, and finally, a sickly pale color that suggested he might vomit right there in the terminal. The world seemed to stop spinning. But Ibrahim wasn't done. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the terminal. Ibrahim gently reached out and took the diplomatic passport from Richard's frozen fingers. He didn't snatch it. He retrieved it with the same calm grace one might use to take a sharp object from a child. "You called this a costume," Ibrahim said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. He wasn't speaking just to Richard anymore. He was speaking to the entire terminal, to the 40 people recording, to the millions who would eventually watch this moment online. "You looked at these clothes and saw poverty. You saw someone who didn't belong in your world of first-class lounges and complimentary champagne. You saw someone you could dismiss, someone you could push aside, someone whose dignity was negotiable because their clothes were not expensive enough." Ibrahim took another step closer. Richard actually flinched, shrinking back against the counter. "But this is not a costume," Ibrahim continued, his hand brushing the fabric of his fatigues. "This is a reminder. While you wear a tailored suit to signal your wealth and status, I wear this uniform to signal my service. I do not dress to impress banking executives in Geneva or mining corporation vice presidents. I dress to stand shoulder to shoulder with the soldiers fighting for my country's survival. I dress to sit with farmers whose crops have failed. I dress to dig wells with villagers who have no clean water." He paused, letting his words settle. "My power does not come from a platinum credit card or a corner office or a Swiss bank account. My power comes from the trust of my people. And that trust is earned every single day through service, through sacrifice, through showing up, not in a luxury motorcade, but in the mud and dust where my people live." The silence in the terminal was absolute. Elena had tears streaming down her face. The security officers stared at the floor, unable to meet Ibrahim's eyes. Several passengers in the crowd were crying. Richard, sweating profusely, tried desperately to salvage the situation. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded more like a whimper. "Mr. President," he stammered, his voice cracking, I had no idea. If I had known who you were, obviously I would have." "You would have what?" Ibrahim interrupted, his eyes boring into Richard's soul. "You would have treated me with respect. You would have waited your turn. You would have kept your hands to yourself." He let the questions hang in the air. "That," Ibrahim said softly, "is exactly the problem. You only respect people when you think they have power over you. You only show courtesy when you believe there might be consequences. But true character, real human decency, is how you treat people who can do absolutely nothing for you. How you treat the janitor, the waiter, the person you think is beneath you." Ibrahim turned to face the security officers, who snapped to attention so quickly they nearly hurt themselves. "Gentlemen," Ibrahim said, his tone gentler now, "you were doing your job as you understood it. I hold no anger toward you. But I hope you will remember this moment. Remember that a badge is a tool for protection, not a weapon for intimidation. Never let a loud voice in an expensive suit tell you who is guilty and who is innocent. Never assume that poverty means criminality or that wealth means honesty." Both officers nodded vigorously, shame and relief washing over their faces in equal measure. "Yes, Mr. President. We are deeply sorry, Mr. President. It won't happen again." Ibrahim picked up his duffel bag, ready to finally board his flight and put this exhausting encounter behind him. But Richard Sterling, in a moment of pure panic and profound stupidity, couldn't just let it go. He would already see the headlines. Mining executive insults African president. He could imagine the board meeting, the questions, possibly even his termination. He needed to fix this disaster immediately, and he tried to do it the only way he knew how, with money. Richard pulled a leather checkbook from his inside jacket pocket with trembling hands. "Mr. President, please," he stammered, stepping forward with desperate energy. "Allow me to make a donation to your government, a gesture of goodwill, a contribution to development projects, whatever you need. We can forget this whole misunderstanding, can't we? Business is business. I'm sure we can work something out." He actually opened the checkbook and pulled out a pen. The crowd gasped again. Someone whispered, "Is he trying to bribe a president?" Ibrahim stopped. He turned around slowly, and the expression on his face wasn't anger anymore. It was something worse, profound disappointment. The look a teacher gives a student who had such potential but chose to cheat instead of learn. He looked at the checkbook, then at Richard's desperate face. "You think your money can fix everything," Ibrahim said quietly. "You think dignity has a price tag. You think integrity can be purchased like a watch or a car. But before The sound of heavy boots running across marble echoed through the terminal, cutting off Ibrahim's words. The doors to the lounge burst open, and a squad of Swiss federal police, not airport security but actual federal officers, swept into the space. They were led by Commandant Henry Dubois, a stern man in his 50s with a jaw like granite and eyes that missed nothing. Richard's face lit up with relief and renewed arrogance. In his delusional mind, real police were here to restore the natural order. Authority figures would surely side with him, a wealthy Western businessman, over this African soldier, president or not. "Finally," Richard shouted, snapping his checkbook shut and pointing at Ibrahim. "Officer, I want to file an official complaint. This man has been harassing me, and now he's attempting to extort money from me using his supposed position. You need to investigate his credentials and escort him from the premises immediately." Commandant Dubois walked right past Richard as if he were invisible. He didn't even glance in his direction. He walked directly to Ibrahim, stopped precisely 1 meter away, snapped his heels together in the European military tradition, and delivered a crisp, respectful salute. "Mr. President," Dubois said, his voice formal and professional, "on behalf of the Geneva Federal Police and the government of Switzerland, please accept our sincere apologies for this disturbance. Captain Miller contacted us directly from the aircraft. We are here to ensure your safe boarding and to address any legal violations that may have occurred." Richard's jaw dropped so hard it practically bounced off the floor. "Wait, what? You're listening to him? I'm the one who called for help. I'm the victim here. Do you know how much I contribute to this city? Do you know how many jobs my company provides? I pay more in taxes in 1 year than—" Commandant Dubois finally turned to Richard. His expression was one of pure disgust, the kind of look you'd give to something unpleasant on the bottom of your shoe. "Sir," Dubois said coldly, "I don't care about your tax contributions. What I do care about is that you just attempted to bribe a foreign head of state in front of 50 witnesses and multiple federal officers. In Switzerland, attempted corruption of a public official, domestic or foreign, is a serious criminal offense under Articles 322 ter through 322 octies of our penal code." Richard's face went from red to white in an instant. I wasn't bribing anyone. I was making a charitable donation. It's completely different. It's diplomacy." "Save your explanations for the magistrate," Dubois said flatly. He nodded to 2 officers flanking him. "Take him." The officers moved forward, producing handcuffs with practiced efficiency. They grabbed Richard's arms, spinning him around and securing his wrists behind his back with mechanical precision. "You can't do this," Richard screamed, his voice rising to a panicked shriek. "I have rights, I have a meeting, I have diplomatic immunity through my corporate status. This is unlawful detention." "You have no such immunity," Dubois replied, "and you have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you exercise." As the officers began to drag Richard toward the exit, he passed directly in front of Ibrahim. The president raised one hand, and the officers immediately stopped, waiting for direction. "Wait," Ibrahim said gently. Richard looked up, hope flickering pathetically in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, the president would show mercy. Maybe he would tell them to let him go. Maybe there was still a way out of this nightmare. Ibrahim looked down at Richard with an expression that held no unger, no satisfaction, no triumph, only profound sadness. "You have a meeting," Ibrahim said softly, his voice barely audible in the hushed terminal. "But you are missing the most important appointment of all, an appointment with your own conscience. You can buy a first-class seat, sir. You can buy platinum status and priority boarding. You can buy designer suits and expensive watches. But you cannot buy class. You cannot purchase dignity. You cannot put a price tag on treating other human beings with respect." He paused, looking directly into Richard's eyes. "I hope that your time in a cell gives you the silence and solitude you need to find your humanity. I hope you use it to reflect on why you believe some people matter and others don't. And I hope, when you emerge, you become the kind of man who would be ashamed of who you were today." Richard slumped, utterly defeated. All the fight went out of him. As the officers resumed dragging him toward the exit, the crowd erupted into spontaneous applause, not just polite clapping, but genuine, thunderous applause. People cheered, some whistled. A few shouted words of support in various languages. It wasn't just because the villain had been vanquished. It was because justice, real, poetic, beautiful justice, had actually been served. In a world where the wealthy usually escaped consequences, where power usually protected power, this moment felt revolutionary. Commandant Dubois turned back to Ibrahim. "Mr. President, the gate is clear and ready for your boarding. Please allow us to escort you to the aircraft with our apologies for this disgraceful incident." Ibrahim nodded graciously. He thanked Alina, who was still wiping tears from her eyes, slipped her a folded note, later discovered to contain a message thanking her for maintaining her integrity under pressure, and walked toward the jet bridge. He didn't strut, he didn't celebrate, he didn't give interviews to the gathered press who had somehow already appeared. He simply walked with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. But as Ibrahim boarded that plane and took his assigned seat in first class, the story was far from over. In fact, the most emotionally powerful moment, the scene that would reduce millions of people to tears, was yet to come. It would happen 30,000 feet in the air, in a small silent interaction that would define what true leadership looks like. The aircraft climbed steadily through the clouds, leaving the snow-covered Alps behind and heading south toward Africa. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and passengers throughout the cabin relaxed, reaching for books, opening laptops, or preparing for sleep. In first class, the atmosphere remained tense despite the luxurious surroundings. The other passengers, business executives, diplomats, wealthy tourists, were acutely aware that they were sharing the cabin with a president. They stole glances at Ibrahim, terrified to make eye contact, uncertain whether they should introduce themselves or maintain respectful distance. Ibrahim sat quietly in seat 1A, the premier position in the aircraft. He had politely declined the flight attendant's offer of champagne, accepting only water. He appeared to be reading a document, but his mind was elsewhere, processing the encounter at the gate. He felt tired, not physically tired. He had endured far more demanding days than this, but spiritually exhausted from having to constantly prove his humanity to people who saw his skin color and military clothes before they saw the man wearing them. Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom, warm and respectful. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. We have a special passenger aboard today who reminded all of us on the ground that respect is earned through character, not purchased with wealth. Mr. President, welcome aboard, and thank you for the lesson in dignity you taught us today." A few passengers clapped politely. Others looked confused, not having witnessed the gate incident. But Ibrahim barely registered the announcement. He was thinking about his country, about the challenges waiting for him when he landed, about the villages without electricity and schools without books and hospitals without medicine. Then he did something that surprised everyone in the cabin. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and picked up his simple duffel bag. The flight attendant rushed over, concerned. "Mr. President, is everything all right? Can I get you anything? More water? Something to eat, we have." Ibrahim smiled gently and shook his head. "Thank you, but no, I am fine. I just need to move to a different seat." "A different seat? But sir, you're in 1A, it's the best seat on the plane. If there's a problem with it, we can." "There is no problem," Ibrahim assured her. "The seat is perfect, but it is needed by someone else more than me." Before anyone could ask what he mean, Ibrahim walked past the galley. past the drawn curtain that separated first class from premium economy, past the premium economy section with its slightly wider seats and slightly more legroom, and into the crowded, cramped world of economy class. The change was immediate and striking. Where first class was spacious and quiet, economy was tight and buzzing with activity. Babies cried. Children kicked seats. The air smelled like a mixture of recycled atmosphere and anxiety. Ibrahim walked down the narrow aisle, his broad shoulders nearly touching the seats on both sides, until he reached row 34. An elderly African woman sat squeezed into the middle seat, the worst seat on any airplane. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond this flight, a bone-deep tiredness that suggested decades of hard living. Her weathered hands held a crying infant, probably her grandchild, and she rocked the baby gently while whispering a soft lullaby in a language Ibrahim recognized, Moray, spoken in northern Burkina Faso. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind of outfit someone carefully preserves for important occasions like travel. Her shoes were practical, resoled multiple times, and told the story of someone who walked long distances regularly. Beside her, pressed against the window, sat a young girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years old. She had her grandmother's gentle eyes, but carried the distinctive marks of illness, a pallor to her skin, a thinness that suggested more than just childhood metabolism, and a surgical scar visible at her collar line. The woman noticed Ibrahim standing in the aisle and immediately tried to calm the crying baby, embarrassed that she might be disturbing other passengers. "I am so sorry," she whispered in French, her accent thick with the rhythms of rural Burkina Faso. "Please forgive us. My grandson, he does not like to fly. I try to quiet him." Ibrahim knelt down in the aisle so he was at eye level with her, a gesture that caught the attention of everyone nearby. Passengers stopped their conversations. The man in 34A looked up from his tablet, confused. "Grandmother," Ibrahim said gently in Moray, switching to her native language, "there is nothing to forgive. A baby cries because that is what babies do. It is the sound of life." The woman's eyes widened with surprise and relief at hearing her own language. She looked at this man in military fatigues more carefully now, trying to place him. "You speak Moray," she said, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. "I do," Ibrahim replied. "I am from Ouagadougou, but my mother's family came from Ouahagouya. Perhaps we are neighbors in the way that all Burkinabé are neighbors." The woman's smile grew wider, and tears began to form in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unexpected kindness of this stranger who saw her as a person, not an inconvenience. "I am Aminata," she said. "This is my granddaughter Fatima and my grandson Moussa." She adjusted the baby in her arms. "We have been in Geneva. Fatima had surgery on her heart, a charity organization. They helped us. God is good, now we go home." Ibrahim looked at the little girl pressed against the window. Fatima stared back at him with solemn, intelligent eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen too much pain too early but still held hope. "Fatima," Ibrahim said softly, "you are very brave. Not many people can say they traveled all the way to Switzerland and back. You are an adventurer." The little girl's face lit up with a shy smile. She nodded but didn't speak, still weak from her surgery. Ibrahim stood up and addressed the man in seat 34A, who had been watching this interaction with growing curiosity. "Excuse me, sir," Ibrahim said, switching to English. "Would you be willing to trade seats with me? I have seat 1A in first class. It reclines fully flat, has much more space, and the service is excellent. I would very much like to sit here instead." The man blinked several times, certain he had misheard. You want to trade first class for a middle seat in economy? Is this a joke?" "No joke," Ibrahim said with a gentle smile. "This grandmother has been caring for her grandchildren alone for many hours. She needs rest. The baby needs space. And I think little Fatima would enjoy looking out the window without being cramped. In first class, there is room for all of this." The man looked at Ibrahim like he was insane, but he wasn't about to refuse. "If you're serious, absolutely. Yes, thank you." They quickly swapped boarding passes. The man grabbed his belongings and practically ran toward the front of the plane, convinced he was getting away with something before this crazy person changed his mind. Ibrahim settled himself into the narrow middle seat that the man had vacated. His knees pressed against the seat in front of him. His shoulders were wider than the seat back. It was immediately and profoundly uncomfortable. Aminata stared at him in shock. No, no, sir, you cannot, this seat. It is not good, you are too big for it. Please take your good seat. We will be fine, we are used to this. I am exactly the right size for this seat, Ibrahim said firmly but kindly, because I am choosing to be here. Now, please, grandmother, let me hold little Mousa while you and Fatima move to first class. The flight attendants are expecting you. Aminata's hands trembled as she tried to process what was happening. But I cannot. I do not belong there. Those seats are for important people, rich people. They will turn us away. Ibrahim reached out and gently took the crying baby from her arms. Mousa, feeling new arms around him, paused in his crying and looked up at Ibrahim's face with wide, curious eyes. You are going to first class, Ibrahim said with finality, because you are important. You are a grandmother who traveled across continents to save her granddaughter's life. You sacrificed everything, your savings, your comfort, your health, so that this beautiful child could have a future. If that does not make you important, then nothing does. Tears streamed freely down Aminata's weathered face now. Who are you? She whispered. What is your name? Ibrahim smiled and bounced Mousa gently in his arms. The baby gurgled and grabbed at his beret. My name is Ibrahim. I am just a servant of Burkina Faso. Now go. Captain Miller is waiting to personally escort you to your seats. Tell him I sent you. A flight attendant had appeared, summoned by the commotion. She took one look at the situation, the president holding a baby in economy class while sending a poor grandmother to first class, and she understood immediately. Her eyes filled with tears. Madame, the attendant said to Aminata, offering her hand, please come with me. We have special seats prepared for you and your granddaughter. Aminata stood on shaky legs. She looked at Ibrahim, then at her grandchildren, then back at Ibrahim. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. What do you say to someone who has just given you dignity when the world has spent so long trying to strip it away? Finally, she reached out and touched Ibrahim's cheek, a gesture of blessing, the kind a mother gives to her child. God sees you, she whispered in Moray. God sees what you do, and God will protect you. Then she took Fatima's hand and allowed the flight attendant to lead them toward the front of the plane. Little Fatima looked back at Ibrahim with wide eyes, waved shyly, and mouthed the word thank you in French. Ibrahim waved back with a hand that wasn't supporting baby Mousa, who had finally stopped crying and seemed quite content to examine this interesting new person's face with chubby fingers. The passengers in the surrounding rows had witnessed everything. They sat in stunned silence, many of them crying openly. A businessman in row 35 pulled out his phone and recorded the scene, not for social media clout, but because he wanted to remember that such kindness was possible. An older woman across the aisle leaned over. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen on an airplane, she said, wiping her eyes. Who are you? Someone who believes that the measure of a society is how it treats those who have the least, Ibrahim replied simply. Now, would you mind helping me? I have held many things in my life, rifles, reports, the hopes of my people, but I am somewhat new to holding babies on airplanes. Do I support the head like this, or like this? The woman laughed through her tears and spent the next few minutes giving Ibrahim a tutorial on proper baby-holding technique, while Mousa drooled contentedly on the president's military fatigues. While Ibrahim sat in row 34 entertaining baby Mousa with improvised peekaboo games, the story of what had happened, both at the gate and on the plane, was spreading across the internet at the speed of light. The 40 witnesses from the Geneva terminal had uploaded their videos within minutes. The algorithms of social media platforms, designed to promote engaging content, immediately recognized that this was something special. Within 2 hours of the incident, #President in Economy was trending worldwide. Within 4 hours, it was the #1 topic in 6 different languages across multiple platforms. Within 6 hours, major news networks on every continent were running the story. But it wasn't just the confrontation with Richard Sterling that captivated people. It was the image of Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, sitting cramped in a middle economy seat, holding a stranger's baby, having given his first-class seat to an elderly grandmother so she could rest after caring for her sick grandchild. The contrast was stark and devastating. In an age of private jets and motorcades, of presidents who shut down entire airports for their convenience, here was a man who chose discomfort so that someone else could have comfort. The videos showed everything. They showed Richard's arrogance and his. complete lack of self-awareness. They showed the security officers' initial bias and their realization of how wrong they had been. They showed Ibrahim's patience, his dignity, his refusal to use his power to humiliate even when he had every right to do so. But more than anything, the videos showed the moment when Ibrahim picked up his bag and walked to economy class. They showed Aminata's tears. They showed little Fatima's shy wave. They showed Ibrahim making funny faces at a baby while his own knees were pressed painfully against the seat in front of him. The comment sections exploded. At Real Leadership, this is what a president looks like, not the suit, not the motorcade, not the private jet. The willingness to sacrifice your own comfort for someone who has nothing to offer you in return. President in Economy. At African Pride 254, Western media always wants to show Africa as corrupt and poor. But here is an African president showing the world what real leadership means. Where are your presidents with this kind of character? President in Economy, Traoré the Great. At History Teacher NYC, showed this video to my high school class today. Half of them were crying by the end. This is the lesson I've been trying to teach about true leadership all year. Thank you, President Traoré, President in Economy. At Former Pilot 77, I flew commercial for 30 years. I've seen presidents, celebrities, billionaires. Not one of them would do what President Traoré did. Not one. This man is special. President in Economy. At Swiss Business, as a Swiss citizen, I am deeply ashamed of how President Traoré was treated in our country. But I am also grateful that he showed us the difference between power and character. We have much to learn. President in Economy apologized to Traoré. The video of Richard Sterling's arrest became its own separate phenomenon. Legal experts appeared on television to discuss the charges. Ethics professors used it as a teaching tool. Corporate consultants included it in training materials about unconscious bias and the dangers of entitlement. Sterling Axum Mining Corporation's stock price dropped 7% in the first day of trading after the incident. The company's board of directors convened an emergency meeting. Richard Sterling III was immediately suspended pending investigation, his access to company systems revoked, his photograph removed from the corporate website. But the company's problems went deeper than one executive's bad behavior. Journalists, energized by the viral video, began investigating Sterling Axum's operations in West Africa. They found environmental violations, labor abuses, suspicious payments to government officials, and communities whose water had been poisoned by mining runoff. Within a week, 3 different countries announced investigations into the company's practices. Within a month, Sterling Axum would lose mining contracts worth over $300 million. Within 6 months, the company would be forced to restructure completely, with Richard Sterling facing not just the Swiss bribery charges, but a cascade of legal actions across multiple jurisdictions. One arrogant moment in an airport terminal had unraveled an entire corporate empire built on exploitation. But the more powerful story, the one that truly captured hearts, was happening 30,000 feet in the air. Ibrahim had discovered that babies are excellent traveling companions because they don't care about your titles or your responsibilities. Moussa didn't know he was being held by a president. He only knew that this man with the gentle hands and funny faces made him feel safe. The businessman from row 35, whose name was Marcus Chen, had been watching the entire interaction. He was Chinese-American, self-made, wealthy, and prided himself on his business acumen and ruthlessness. He had spent the last year closing deals across Africa, always focused on maximizing profit, never particularly concerned with the human cost. But watching Ibrahim, watching the president of a nation choose discomfort for someone else's benefit, had shaken something loose in Marcus's carefully constructed worldview. "Excuse me," Marcus said, leaning across the aisle. "May I ask you something?" Ibrahim looked up from the baby, who had finally fallen asleep against his chest. "Of course." "Why did you do it?" Marcus asked. "Not just giving up your seat, anyone could do that if they wanted to look good, but the way you dealt with that man at the gate. You had the power to destroy him the moment he touched you. You could have had him arrested immediately. You could have made him grovel, but you didn't. You tried to teach him instead. Why?" Ibrahim was quiet for a moment, gently adjusting Mouse's position so the baby would be more comfortable. "Because revenge is easy," Ibrahim finally said. "Humiliation is easy. Using power to crush someone who is weaker than you, even if they deserve it, is the easiest thing in the world. but does it change anything? Does it make them understand? Or does it just make them more bitter, more hateful, more convinced that they are the victim? He looked at Marcus directly. I wanted that man to see his own reflection clearly. I wanted him to understand that his wealth and his status had blinded him to his own humanity. Maybe he will change. Maybe he will not. But at least I gave him the truth instead of simply punishing him. Marcus nodded slowly, processing this. I think I've been like him, he admitted quietly. Not that extreme, but I've cut corners. I've ignored suffering if it wasn't convenient to address. I told myself it was just business, just the way the world works. The world works the way we make it work, Ibrahim replied. Every person who says this is just how things are is choosing to accept injustice rather than challenge it. You are a businessman. You have resources, connections, influence. The question is, what will you do with them? Marcus sat back in his seat, staring at the ceiling of the aircraft, thinking about the contracts in his briefcase and the choices he would face when he landed. An elderly African-American man from row 33 had been listening to this conversation. His name was Dr. Jerome Washington, a retired professor of African-American studies from Howard University, returning from a conference in Europe. Mr. President, Dr. Washington said, his voice carrying the musical cadence of the American South, do you mind if an old man shares an observation? Please, Ibrahim said. I grew up in Mississippi in the 1950s and 60s, Dr. Washington began. I marched with Dr. King. I was arrested 6 times for sitting at lunch counters where I wasn't supposed to sit. I spent my whole life studying dignity, what it means, where it comes from, how people maintain it even when systems try to strip it away. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. What you did today, both at the gate and on this plane, is the most profound demonstration of dignity I have witnessed in my 78 years. Not because you defeated a bully, though you did. Not because you were merciful, though you were. But because you showed us that true power is choosing service over status. You showed us that the most radical act in a world obsessed with hierarchy is to willingly move down so that others can move up. Ibrahim felt his own eyes burn with unexpected emotion. He had been fighting so hard for so long to be taken seriously as a leader, to have his ideas heard, to protect his country from forces both internal and external that wanted to exploit it. Sometimes he wondered if any of it mattered. Thank you, Ibrahim said quietly. That means more to me than you know. Dr. Washington reached across the aisle and briefly clasped Ibrahim's free hand, the one not supporting the sleeping baby. History will remember you, he said. Not just for what you accomplish as president, but for the example you set of what leadership should be. Other passengers began to lean in, drawn by the conversation. A young Nigerian woman, a software engineer working in London, an elderly French couple who had spent 40 years teaching in rural Senegal, a Burkinabe student returning home from university in Paris, a Brazilian journalist who specialized in covering African affairs. They didn't ask for selfies or autographs. They simply shared their stories, their hopes, their dreams for a better world. And Ibrahim listened to all of them, still holding Moussa, still cramped in his uncomfortable middle seat, but more content than he had been in months. Because this connection with real people facing real challenges, was why he had wanted to serve in the first place. 5 hours into the flight, one of the first-class flight attendants came back to economy class. Her name was Sophie, and she had been working for the airline for 12 years. She had seen everything, celebrities, politicians, billionaires, royalty. But she had never seen anything like what was happening on this flight. She found Ibrahim still in row 34, baby Moussa sleeping peacefully in his arms. The president looked exhausted but at peace. Mr. President, Sophie said gently, I need to tell you something. Aminata is crying. Ibrahim's expression immediately shifted to concern. Is she unwell? Does she need medical attention? No, sir, Sophie said, her own voice breaking slightly. She's crying because she doesn't believe this is real. She keeps saying that people like her don't get treated like this. She keeps trying to leave the first-class seat because she's convinced someone will yell at her. She's terrified that this is all a mistake, and someone will come to humiliate her for daring to sit where she doesn't belong. Ibrahim carefully transferred the sleeping baby to the grandmother in row 34C, who had offered to help. Then he unbuckled himself and stood up, his body protesting from hours in the cramped seat. Take me to her, he said. Sophie led him back through the curtain. N into premium economy, and then through another curtain into first class. The contrast was jarring, from the cramped, noisy world of economy to the spacious, hushed luxury of the front cabin. There in seat 1A, the best seat on the plane, sat Aminata. She was perched on the very edge of the seat as if afraid to actually use it. Her hands were folded in her lap and tears streamed down her face. Little Fatima was beside her in 1B, asleep in the fully reclined seat, finally comfortable for the first time in days. Aminata looked up and saw Ibrahim approaching. She immediately tried to stand, to give up the seat, to return to where she thought she belonged. "No, grandmother," Ibrahim said firmly, gently pressing her shoulder so she would remain seated. "You are exactly where you should be." "But I am nobody," Aminata whispered, her voice breaking. "I am just an old woman. I clean houses. I fetch water. I do not deserve this." Ibrahim knelt down beside her seat so they were eye level. He took both of her weathered hands in his. "Listen to me carefully," he said in Malay, his voice intense but kind. "You are not nobody. You are a woman who raised children and then raised your grandchildren when your daughter could not. You are a woman who worked until your hands bled so that little Fatima could see a doctor. You are a woman who traveled thousands of kilometers to save a child's life. You are a woman who never stopped fighting, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that tomorrow could be better." He squeezed her hands gently. "If you are nobody, then what am I? I sit in offices and sign papers. I give speeches and shake hands. But you build the future with your own hands, one child at a time, one meal at a time, one day of hard work at a time. The only difference between us is that people gave me a title, but titles mean nothing. It is what we do for others that defines us." Aminata sobbed openly now, decades of pain and invisibility pouring out of her. She had spent her whole life being told, sometimes with words, more often with looks and gestures, that she was less than, that her work didn't matter, that her sacrifices weren't significant, that people like her should be grateful for whatever scraps they received. And now here was a president, a real president, telling her that she mattered, that her life had value, that she deserved dignity not because of what she owned or where she sat, but because she was human. "I will pray for you every day," Aminata finally managed to say. "Every morning and every night I will ask God to protect you, because the world needs men like you." "And the world needs women like you," Ibrahim replied. "Now please rest. Let this seat serve the purpose it was meant to serve, to give comfort to someone who has earned it." He stood up and looked around the first-class cabin. Every passenger was watching. Several were crying. A German businessman had his phone out, but when Ibrahim looked at him, the man immediately lowered it. "Go ahead," Ibrahim said. "Share what you see. The world needs to know that there are still people who believe that every human being deserves respect. That comfort should go to those who need it, not just those who can afford it. That we rise by lifting others, not by stepping on them." The German businessman nodded, grateful for the permission, and continued recording. Ibrahim walked back through the curtain, back through premium economy, back to his middle seat in row 34, where baby Mousa was just beginning to stir and fuss again. He settled back into the uncomfortable seat, took the baby from the grandmother who had been holding him, and resumed making funny faces until Mousa giggled. And that's how the president of Burkina Faso spent the rest of his flight home, squeezed into a middle seat in economy class, entertaining a stranger's grandchild, while in first class, an elderly woman who cleaned houses for a living finally rested in the dignity she had always deserved but had rarely been given. When the plane landed in Ouagadougou, things did not go as they typically did for presidential arrivals. Usually, Ibrahim's security team would be waiting on the tarmac. There would be a brief ceremony, some photographs, and a quick motorcade to the presidential residence. It was efficient, professional, and utterly forgettable. But someone on the flight had contacted the media, and the media had contacted the public, and the public decided they needed to be there. When the aircraft door opened, Ibrahim handed Mousa back to Aminata, who had come back to economy class to retrieve her grandchildren. She hugged Ibrahim tightly, whispering blessings in his ear, and then followed the other passengers toward the exit. Ibrahim let everyone else deplane first, as he always did. He believed that presidents should be last on and last off, servants, not masters. When he finally emerged from the jet bridge into the terminal, he stopped in surprise. The airport was packed. Thousands of people had somehow gotten past security and filled the arrival hall. They held signs. They waved flags, and when they saw him, they erupted in deafening cheers. Ibrahim, Ibrahim, Ibrahim. His security team looked panicked, but Ibrahim waved them back. He walked into the crowd and they surrounded him, not threatening, not crushing, but embracing. People reached out to touch his hand, his shoulder, his uniform. Old women blessed him. Young men saluted him. Children stared at him with wide eyes, seeing a hero from a story come to life. A local television crew pushed their way forward, and a reporter thrust a microphone toward him. Mr. President, the entire country, the entire world, has seen what happened in Geneva. How do you respond to those who are calling you a hero? Ibrahim looked uncomfortable with the word. I am not a hero. I simply treated people the way everyone should be treated. But that's exactly why people are calling you a hero, the reporter pressed. Because what should be normal is now extraordinary. What do you say to the millions of people who have been inspired by your actions? Ibrahim looked out at the crowd, his people, the people he had sworn to serve. He saw their faces, young and old, hopeful and hardened, all of them looking at him as if he had done something miraculous. But all he had done was act like a human being. I say this, Ibrahim finally answered, his voice carrying across the terminal through the microphone. Dignity is not a gift that the powerful give to the powerless. It is not something that must be earned through wealth or status or education. Dignity is the birthright of every human being, simply because they exist. He paused, making sure people were listening. What happened in Geneva was not heroic. What was heroic was Aminata, who sacrificed everything to save her granddaughter. What was heroic was little Fatima, who endured surgery and pain with bravery. What was heroic was every single person who has ever been treated as less than human, and yet still chose to believe in their own worth. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. I am your president, yes, but I am also your brother. I am also your servant. And I will spend every day of my leadership trying to build a country where what happened on that airplane is not extraordinary, where it is simply normal, where the grandmother who cleans houses is treated with the same respect as the businessman in first class, where the child in the rural village has the same opportunities as the child in the capital city, where your dignity is never questioned because of the color of your skin, the clothes you wear, or the size of your bank account. The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't just cheering. People were crying, massive, cathartic crying, because for so long they had been told that they were less than, that Africa was less than, that their lives and their struggles didn't matter to the world. And here was one of their own, showing the world that they mattered very much indeed. Richard Sterling III sat in a small holding cell in Geneva, awaiting his trial on bribery and corruption charges. His expensive lawyer had managed to delay proceedings multiple times, but the weight of evidence, including video footage watched by millions, made his prospects dim. He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his marriage. His wife had filed for divorce within a week of the incident, apparently deciding that her social standing couldn't survive being associated with that racist from the airport. His children, adults themselves, had released a public statement disowning his behavior and apologizing to President Traoré. Sterling Axum Mining had terminated his employment, revoked his pension, and was currently suing him for damages related to the loss of contracts his behavior had caused. The company itself was barely surviving, having been forced to implement massive reforms or face complete collapse. But the worst part, the part that haunted Richard in his cell at night, was that he had become a global symbol. He was the example that professors used when teaching about privilege. He was the cautionary tale that corporations referenced in ethics training. He was the villain in a story that would be told for generations. His lawyer had tried to broker a deal. Richard would issue a public apology, donate a substantial sum to Burkina Faso development projects, and perform community service. In exchange, the Swiss government would reduce the charges. The lawyer had sent the proposal to President Traoré's office, expecting either acceptance or a counteroffer. Instead, they received a handwritten letter from the president himself. Richard's lawyer read it to him through the cell bars. Mr. Sterling's money cannot purchase forgiveness, because forgiveness is not mine to sell. It belongs to every person he has ever treated as less than human. His apology means nothing if it is given only to escape co. End sequences. True change comes from within, from genuine reflection on the harm one has caused. However, I do not wish for him to rot in prison. I wish for him to become a better man. I recommend that the Swiss authorities require him to spend 2 years volunteering in African communities affected by exploitative mining practices. Let him meet the children who work in mines so his company can profit. Let him meet the women who walk miles for clean water because his company polluted their rivers. Let him see the humanity he has spent his life ignoring. Perhaps then he will understand why dignity matters. Ibrahim Traoré. Richard had wept when he heard those words, not because he was grateful, though he was, but because even now, even after everything, President Traoré was trying to teach him something. The Swiss court had accepted the recommendation. In 3 months, Richard Sterling III would begin a 2-year service program in West Africa. No armed guards, no special treatment. Just him, living in villages, working alongside the people his company had exploited, finally learning what it meant to see people as people. Whether he would learn the lesson remained to be seen, but at least he would have the opportunity. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, something remarkable was happening. The video of Ibrahim's gesture on the airplane had inspired a movement. It started small. People in Ouagadougou began giving up their seats on public buses to elderly passengers and people with children. Then it spread to schools, where students started a dignity initiative, pledging to treat everyone with respect regardless of their social status. Then it jumped to other countries. In Ghana, a wealthy businessman made headlines by eating lunch in the workers' cafeteria instead of his private dining room. In Kenya, a government official was photographed waiting in the regular line at a hospital instead of using his connections to skip ahead. In Europe and America, the movement took on different forms. People started calling out privilege when they saw it. They started checking their own biases. They started asking themselves the question Ibrahim had posed: how do I treat people who can do nothing for me? There was pushback, of course. Critics called it performative. They said one gesture couldn't change systems. They argued that Ibrahim himself was part of the problem, a military leader who had come to power through a coup, his own legitimacy questionable. And they weren't entirely wrong. Ibrahim was imperfect. His government made mistakes. His policies weren't always successful. He had enemies, some with legitimate grievances. But what he had shown in that moment at the airport was something true and pure. That leadership is not about the height of your position, but about the depth of your character. That power is not something to wield over others, but to use for others. That dignity is not negotiable, not for sale, and not dependent on your ability to pay for it. 1 year after the incident, Ibrahim Traoré was invited to speak at the United Nations General Assembly. It was his first address to the international body since becoming president, and the chamber was packed. World leaders, diplomats, journalists, everyone wanted to hear from the man who had become known as the president in economy. Ibrahim walked to the podium wearing not a business suit, but his military fatigues. The same ones he had worn that day in Geneva. They had been cleaned and pressed, but they were unmistakably the same uniform. He looked out at the sea of faces, some friendly, some hostile, most simply curious. "Distinguished delegates," he began, his deep voice carrying through the chamber. "I stand before you today not as a perfect man, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who believes deeply in the potential of humanity to be better than we are." He paused, letting his words settle. Many of you have seen the video from Geneva. Many of you have heard the story of the grandmother and the first-class seat. Some of you have praised me. Some of you have criticized me. Some of you have wondered what I hoped to gain from that gesture. Ibrahim smiled slightly. "I will tell you what I gained. I gained 5 hours of discomfort in a middle seat. I gained a baby who drooled on my uniform. I gained a reminder of why I serve." Quiet laughter rippled through the chamber. But more importantly, I helped Aminata gain something far more valuable than a comfortable seat. I helped her gain the recognition that she matters, that her sacrifices are seen, that her dignity is not subject to the price of an airline ticket. His voice grew more serious. We live in a world obsessed with hierarchy, with who is above and who is below, with who deserves comfort and who deserves struggle. We have created systems, economic, political, social, that tell us some people are worth more than others, that some lives matter more than other lives, that some pain is tragic while other pain is simply expected. He looked directly at the camera, broadcasting his speech around the world. I reject this, completely, absolutely, without reservation. Every child born into poverty is not less valuable than a child born into wealth. Every woman working 3 jobs to feed her family is not less dignified than a CEO working from a yacht. Every person struggling to survive in a refugee camp is not less deserving of respect than a person living in a mansion. His voice rose with passion. The measure of our civilization is not how we treat the powerful. The powerful can demand good treatment. The measure of our civilization is how we treat those who have no power to demand anything. The elderly, the sick, the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. Ibrahim stepped away from the podium, standing at the edge of the stage, speaking directly to the assembly. I am here to tell you that dignity is not a luxury. It is not something we can afford to give to some people but not others. It is not dependent on GDP or military strength or diplomatic status. Dignity is a human right, and rights, by definition, are universal. He returned to the podium to deliver his closing words. So I issue this challenge to every leader in this chamber and to every person watching around the world: choose dignity. Choose it when it is inconvenient. Choose it when no one is watching. Choose it for people who cannot reward you for it. Choose it for people who might never thank you for it. Choose it because it is right, not because it is profitable. He gripped the edges of the podium. Because in the end, we will not be remembered for our wealth or our titles or the size of our offices. We will be remembered for how we treated other human beings when we had the power to treat them poorly. That is the only measure that matters. That is the only legacy worth leaving. Ibrahim stepped back from the podium. The chamber was silent for a heartbeat. Then, starting from the back of the room, people began to stand. One by one, then in groups, then as an entire body, the delegates of the United Nations rose to their feet. The applause started as a whisper, grew to a rumble, and became a thunderous ovation that lasted for 5 full minutes. Presidents applauded. Prime ministers applauded. Even the diplomats from nations that opposed Ibrahim's policies found themselves applauding because some truths transcend politics. In a small village in Burkina Faso, Aminata watched the speech on a borrowed television powered by a new solar panel, part of a rural electrification project that had been funded by donations inspired by the Geneva incident. Fatima sat beside her grandmother, healthy now, her heart repaired by the surgery she had received in Switzerland. When Ibrahim finished speaking, Aminata touched the television screen gently, as if she could reach through and touch the man who had shown her that she mattered. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." And in that moment, across thousands of miles and countless differences in circumstance, Ibrahim and Aminata were connected by the simplest and most powerful force in the human experience: the recognition of shared humanity. Because in the end, dignity is not about where you sit on an airplane. It's about whether you remember that everyone on board is making the same journey. The end. Author's note: this story is a work of fiction inspired by themes of dignity, leadership, and human equality. While based on the real existence of President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the events depicted in this narrative are fictional and created to explore these universal themes. The true measure of any leader, and any person, is not found in grand gestures alone, but in the daily choices we make about how to treat our fellow human beings.